for queer families, we have to have a place that, like, even just for a little while, we can turn off the noise, we can turn off the like feeling of that rejection.
Welcome to Talking About Kids. I'm your host, R. Bradley Snyder, researcher, activist, and author of The 5 Simple Truths of Raising Kids. It goes without saying that would-be parents who are supported have healthier babies. For this 4th Pride Month installment of Talking About Kids, I wanted to address the perinatal care that queer individuals receive because it can be stressful and dehumanizing in ways that have negative short-term and long-term consequences for them and their children. My guest to discuss this issue is Bianca Sprague. Bianca is a passionate advocate for perinatal care for marginalized communities, an author, an educator, and the founder of Bibo Mia, a training and mentorship organization that promotes, quote, anti-racist, anti-oppressive, trauma-informed, and intersectional, end quote, approaches to reproductive health. This episode is sponsored in part by the Arizona Department of Health Services Must Stop Bullying campaign through its Title V Maternal and Child Health Program. For more information, go to muststopbullying.org. And now, the interview.
My journey into doula work was a strange one. My plan was actually to be an OB-GYN. And after the birth of my daughter, I realized the relationship that my doctor had to my birth was not at all the one that I wanted to have. And I knew that it was a place that I don't know why I thought the role of the doctor would do what I wanted to do for birth, but I knew birth was sacred and I knew it needed to be protected. And I knew that these were critical moments that really defined both the birthing person as well as the infant or infants and the entire family in this like ripple effect that would, I believe change the world if we were birthing from a place of informed consent and autonomy and power rather than from this collapse that is happening currently within the field of reproductive health, which is really a disempowering journey, a crisis journey, a commodification of the body journey. And so, the majority of people leaving their birth experience report trauma. The rate of PTSD is in the majority. Mental health has never been poorer for birthing folks and their partners if they have them. And so, it's not working out right now. Right. And folks from marginalized communities. And so, when we're looking at reproductive health, that's the queer community, that's the BIPOC or racialized community, that's people living in bigger bodies or fat bodies or plus size bodies, whatever language people feel really good about. People who are deemed too young, too old, and the rates of maternal and infant mortality and morbidity just keep going up. And so I really saw it as a place that I could make the difference that I thought I was going to make as a doctor. But really, I got to do that as a doula, which took a little bit actually to shift from, the years of preparation I had made to get into medical school and to decide to quit. It was not a decision I took lightly, but it was, it took a long time for me to find my voice and the role in the room when I still saw doctors as something of, powerful authority and something that I had a reverence for. I've since then have shaken most of that off after almost 20 years of doing this. So that's my kind of long answer about how I came into this work and why I really wanted to keep marginalized folks safe.
Now, and I have to, please forgive my ignorance in this, but I haven't spent time in the doula literature in actually a really long time. And I think that my idea of the role of a doula is out of date. Can you, first of all, can you explain what a doula is for my listeners who might not be familiar with it? And then also, can you tell me about how you perceive the role of the doula to be? Because I suspect that even how you approach it might even be different than my outdated notion of what it is.
Yeah, well, I would say it has shifted dramatically, the definition and the role that a doula holds. So, I mean, in summation, a doula really is there to provide informational, physical, and emotional support to families going through their preconception.
Yeah.
So that's their fertility journey, their pregnancies and antepartum journey into their birth and immediate postpartum. There's also doulas that focus specifically on loss or death. And so, you know, the role of doula has dramatically expanded even from when I started practicing, as I say, almost 20 years ago. But we're really there to work outside the system so that we can bridge that gap between healthcare providers or community support workers or social workers, whoever else is involved with the family's care. And we bridge that to the families so that we really want to make sure people know that things aren't happening to them and that they're choosing them. And, you know, what's happening in our current system is something called practice-based care, which is just everybody gets that and everybody does this. And when you come in, this is what all the people get.
Right.
And we really want to bring it back to evidence-based care because right now, what's happening in preconception all the way to the postpartum period is in complete violation of actually the governing bodies that regulate the practitioners that are, you know, upholding this practice-based versus evidence-based care. And so really a doula is there to, you know, hold that space and allow a family to know the benefits, the risks, you know, what is their intuition saying, which I think is the most important. What are the alternatives and what happens when we do nothing? And so that's the acronym BRAIN. And we really want to make sure we support families in going through that acronym from fertility all the way to forever.
Well, can you go through that
yeah.
acronym with me, please? Can you? So BRAIN stands for what?
So the benefits. So let's say if we're looking in, somebody's in labor and they come in and say, you know, looks like we're going to have to break your water, which is, I don't love that language. I usually use like release the waters, artificial rupture of membrane. You might hear it as ARM or AROM. All of those mean the same thing. And so I look at my clients. Now I've done a whole bunch of prenatal work with them. So we're not having this conversation for the first time when they're in labor because that's not the time to have those conversations. Because that frontal lobe, we really want that to shut down, which is a feature of labor, is that we don't have that, you know, reasonable, rational thinking so that we can have a loss of time, we can get into labor land. And so we've talked about this. So I've actually said, so they're going to come in and say, we're going to move this along and we're going to break your water. And then I've figured, like, you know, said, how do you feel about that? Do you know the research about it? Do you know the benefits and the risk, blah, blah, blah. So when we get there, I can look at them and they can go through their brain. So they know that the benefit might speed up labor. It might. And so, you know, that at that moment, them knowing that, I could be like, so do you remember the benefits and the risks? And so they can, you know, say, yeah, actually, I do want to get this going faster. Like I'm feeling whatever. And so great. So now we've got a pro and then we go into the risk. We start a timer as soon as your membranes release. The hospital has a timer and it is about 300% shorter than the recommendation from the governing body, where we then move over to an operative birth or C-section or a belly birth, all the same thing. And so we go, okay, benefits. So the risk is now the timer starts. We do have an increased risk of infection because now that protection is broken between the baby and the outside world. The baby might not like it. It does offer a lot of protection for the baby. So we might see a different type of tracing with their heart rate. You know, and the sensation goes up dramatically. So I'm like, it might go faster, but it is going to have a lot more sensation for you. So they can stand in that moment knowing that they have those two things and be like, ooh, I don't think I'm handling it right now. And I don't think I could if the sensation changed. And then we go into that intuition. So I'll be like, what does your gut say? Just like quick yes or no. And if they're like, no, then I'm like, great. That's where we're at. And then we move over to that. Oh, we asked for the alternatives. Sorry, I skipped A. So I'd be like, what, the alternatives are, we could have some nipple stimulation. You could just go in the bathroom, close the door, and we all stay out here and you just like take some time alone. We could do some types of massage. There's some position changes we could do. We could walk. All of these things will also speed up labor. And then we get to the end where I'm like, do you just want to do nothing right now? And we'll reconvene in an hour. And then they have that acronym. Again, we've done a lot of the conversational part ahead of time. And so in that moment, they can run down their BRAIN and then land at their answer, which is something that they chose. And that's how, as a birth worker, I never am attached to what they're choosing. I'm like, I always make sure I present it as evenly as possible. So not like, there's all these good things and only a little bit of bad things, so that otherwise I'm doing what doctors are doing and I'm just trying to guide them to what I hope that they choose. And at the end of it, even if somebody didn't have the birth that they imagined going in, they feel empowered in it and they chose it. So they chose to say yes to that C-section, even though they really wanted a pelvic birth. But because every step getting to there, they knew the benefits and the risks. And so they got to like navigate through that hospital or birth center or home birth journey really, really powerfully.
And so why I wanted to go back to it is because I think that longtime listeners of Talking About Kids, their ears probably pricked up a little bit when you said that you wanted them to lose their prefrontal lobe. Because we spent a lot of time when we were talking about kids specifically, about keeping them regulated. So we want them to have that prefrontal lobe functioning, right? But then when you describe that brain process, the acronym brain, that process, I don't think I'm alone. I'm sure my listeners are thinking, but that sounds like a trauma-informed approach. You are providing much safety. You're providing alternatives. You're empowering with each step that you're making. And I'm just thinking not just about applying it in the circumstance that you're talking about, but I'm thinking about like how that might work in a classroom or an after-school program too. That I think it's wonderful, by the way. So one of the things that is, I just have this side question about it. Are your clients coming to you, or is a doula typically going to his or her clients?
Yeah, so it depends.
Okay.
There's been a lot of movement in the U.S. where now insurance providers, including Medicaid and TRICARE, which is the military, that they are actually covering doulas.
Yeah.
And so now insurance providers, depending the type of registration a doula has with the provider, so you can either... I'm trying to learn all the American. It's very different here in Canada.
Right.
But you can either be registered on their roster, or you can have it where you get reimbursed by the insurance provider. And if you're registered on the roster, the insurance provider actually kind of like wants folks to be using those services because it costs them less down the road. Because we know the benefit of having a doula present decreases operative birth rates. It increases feeding from your body if families are choosing to breastfeed or chest feed. It's, we see lower rates of interventions. We see higher birth weights. So like all this, we see less postpartum mood disorders. And so all of those other things cost the system a lot of money. And so in that case, hospitals are promoting and insurance providers are promoting and, other kind of bodies like the military would be promoting accessing that care. But otherwise, I train doulas and I also have a doula business school. And so I teach doulas how to solve major problems for families, as well as how to integrate into the community. So we are integrating with PSWs and daycare workers, massage therapists, chiropractors, because it really takes this team. We all have a different scope and a different role. And so in that case, they might be solving a very specific problem. And so, I have folks that niche and they're like the VBAC doula, and a VBAC is a vaginal birth after cesarean. And so they're actually going into the community of people who are looking to have VBACs and providing a lot of that education. And then it feels like just like a natural transition that they would also support them either in the birth or that postpartum period. So depending on the model that they're working within as a private practice or a hospital program or an agency or something like that, we're seeing both. However, the stats came out post-COVID. I mean, not that we're really post-COVID, but like the initial like full lockdown. And it's really sad that we got this research, but the research is invaluable. And we had actually, depending on the state or province you were in, 12 full months of no doulas allowed in the space. And so we have this research that we can show when we're in the space and when we're not in the space. And when we weren't in the space, it allowed providers to essentially do what they wanted to do, which involves a lot of medical coercion. And so the birth outcomes and the mortality and morbidity rate had never been worse. And no surprise, the folks that were the most impacted, who had the worst impact, the worst outcomes, were from the racialized and queer community. And so, we make a difference, and people are catching on and really identifying that. It was interesting something you said right before, though, about the trauma and that informed consent and that frontal lobe, that when that piece, I was just thinking about it as I was talking, that piece, when we allow birthing people to get into that safe labor land and birth from a place of power, when they get into the postpartum period, because of the state of development of the infant brain, we actually do that co-regulation, and parents are able to now co-regulate with their infant, which is required until they have completed that whole portion of the brain around the brainstem, which is critical for baby self-regulation. And so when we do that in, empowered birth, when folks get to have that trauma-informed care, they can actually step into the postpartum period being able to co-regulate. But what we are actually seeing is that parents are dysregulated coming out of their births because they feel trauma. They feel, even if they don't know, they would describe it as like a normal birth, which a normal birth means you go into triage, you get hooked up to machines, you get told to take off your clothes, they break your water, they start Pitocin, they use vacuum forceps. If those don't work, you go to the OR. And everyone's like, oh yeah, it's just regular, which is just heartbreaking to me. This loss, this loss of birth culture. And so parents are then coming out of that very dysregulated, and then they're not able to co-regulate with their infant. And then these infants continue with this inability to have that co-regulation. And then we go in and see these infants going, this disordered attachment, mental health issues, and that's rotating in. So, within our doula program, we actually teach about attachment science, so that people understand the journey through that preconception, that labor, and that postpartum period is a generational gift that we're doing for ourselves, which can involve healing post. So if you do have a birth trauma or you do struggle with PTSD, you can do that healing and still provide that gift for your baby, which is something I feel like it's really important to really continue to emphasize the plasticity of neuro health and development in our infants and our children, so that we don't feel like we failed if we sleep trained and now we know more, or we didn't heal our PTSD and now we know more, that we can kind of go back and do that healing work, including getting teachers involved or other community programs, so that we have that kind of, we're going to shift and we're going to do something else to teach children how to do that really healthy co-regulation until they have that interdependence in adulthood.
So I'm hearing just so many benefits that for so many different, for really everyone. Of course, there's some obvious sort of impediments to good care that the doula breaks down. And I'm thinking also about people who have housing insecurity, people that have income insecurity. Right now in the traditional medical world, they're kind of forced to get all of their care at the convenience of the doctor, right? It's during work hours, and it's during abbreviated, this weird work day that really doesn't exist anywhere except for, it seems like, in the medical community, where you have to do everything between 10 and 4 every day. And if you've got a job in the service industry, so that's hard for a lot of families. But one of the things that I want to talk about, given that this is Pride Month, is that you noticed also that there was a lot of perinatal care that was being either denied to queer individuals, or they were having a more difficult time accessing it. Tell me about your experience there.
Oh my goodness, we have so far to go, and it just feels like we're going backwards, especially when we look in the US, the loss of rights and access for queer individuals and queer families. And so, I mean, I didn't realize how, I don't know why. I think I have a lot of privilege because I'm straight passing, which has a gift and a curse, don't get me wrong. But, accessing care as a queer person, I started just noticing it through my personal journey of like how much different it was. And, my wife not being allowed to be in the room where they'd say friends need to wait in the hall, which, in other situations I saw straight people, they got to be like, oh, of course, your husband.
Encouraged, right.
Yeah, like your husband, bring him on
Right.
in. Oh,
Right.
so great he's here. Like, what and, I'd be like, your friend needs to wait in the hall, or like, your sister can just be over here. I'm like, oh my goodness. So I noticed that. And then, as I started doing predominantly queer care as a birth worker, depending on the state or the province that families are birthing in, there's so many issues around, like queer families have to adopt their children. I mean,
Right.
Let's actually go preconception, access to affordable IUI or IVF, or, access to a surrogacy community is prohibitive for so many queer families. And with the loss of so many states now clawing back access to IUI and IVF, what we see it as like an issue for straight infertility, but really it's a statement of blocking access for queer families.
Yeah.
And so when people are like, but how are, barren couples supposed to have babies? And I was like, how is anybody queer supposed to have a
Right.
baby? And that's, that is what is being done in these policies. And so, we have made progress in certain places, like in Ontario, actually a few provinces in Canada, they will cover your first rounds of IVF and IUI for queer families, which is amazing. But like, if it doesn't take, then you're starting at that like $10,000-$15,000 a try after that. And so, there was also a lack of access to donors in Canada. And we weren't allowed international donors. And it changed maybe about, I'd say 10 years ago. And it was in response to, the queer gaydos in major cities had too many half siblings in the schools. And so now we were having, they did a book actually in Toronto, that's my city, that of all these children from the same donor, because there was less than like 15 donors at a time. And so the one that's really good, everybody wanted them. And so, but the local elementary school for where in the predominantly gay areas of the city had all these half siblings that were unknown, and you can't have those. Like, that's how one of the things with reproductive technologies is you need to be able to have donor samples dispersed so that we don't have an issue of unknown siblings having relationships. And so that actually was a jumpstart for us having better access to more donors. And now we can access American banks and have it brought into Canadian clinics to ensure that kind of support. But so there's like a whole bunch of barriers. The counseling that you have to go to before you have children is like, it still has like a really hum of Christian values to it. And it's really terrible. Like the questions that they ask, same-sex couples or poly families, they're just like, straight people don't have to be asked these questions. The forms are usually not very gender affirming, and they're very gendered, and it's very hard to find practitioners that will support gender expansive and trans community. Even the language of using a surrogate, everything is still, even if they're like, yeah, we got it. But it's still very much like that's the parent. So it might say parent instead of a space just of like the birthing person, the person giving birth, the person in labor, which would capture issues when it's the intended parents are not in labor and they're whoever is their surrogate or, the family or the person who's having the baby. So, we haven't even like had a baby yet. And there's all these barriers and issues. And then, once we have that baby, there's the parental issues of, as I say, adoption, and there's many states that will not recognize it. And so I actually had a client who had her first baby with her wife, and the wife actually had a stroke right after birth and was bedridden for was fairly high needs, low functioning for probably forever. But
Wow.
by year 3, the grandparents of the birthing mom who had the stroke, the grandparents stepped in and said, we want to take our grandson and our daughter and move to our state. And the other mom, who had been doing full-time care of her wife and her 3-year-old, had no rights. And the grandparents came and they took the wife and they took the infant, or the toddler, preschooler. And my client never saw them again.
Right.
They never saw their son again because they had no legal rights over him because they didn't recognize same-sex parents. And so, that did change. There was a change called Cy and Ruby's bill in Ontario. It was actually my clients, which was really amazing. They were both real feisty lawyers. So after they went through their experience, they were like, oh, heck no. Heck no. We're taking this right to the Prime Minister. And they did. And so now you can have 3-parent birth certificates for situations of 3 or more parents. And you don't have to adopt your child. You just write the other parent's name on the form, just like every other straight privileged moment. And so you just do it on the statement of live birth of parent 1, parent 2, maybe parent 3. And I think that's really cool. And that shows a lot of progress, which can kind of balance out the complete loss of those rights or the loss of, or the never having had of those rights for a lot of families in many other states and areas of the world.
And as you've already mentioned, you teach your families about attachment, but any disruption in those first few moments of life between the child and their primary care providers has immense consequences. So if you're moving this infant around, if there is any sort of this newborn rather around, if there's any sort of juggling, any sort of transfer where they are denied access to the primary care providers, that has tremendous consequences over their lifetime. So, I mean, just really allowing for, the parents to be present from the beginning, I think is such a huge step. So.
Yeah. No, it's shocking how different the treatment is. I mean, and I saw most of my queer clients were in Toronto, which is a pretty progressive city. Like, I'd say we do all right. But it was still, I mean, I had terrible care always as a lesbian accessing anything to do with my care. Procedures where they were inserting things, they'd be like, yeah, but you got pregnant. I was like, you have no idea how I got pregnant. And it's none of your business. And if I say I don't want something inserted into me, I'm saying I don't want that inserted into me. So and they're like, well, how do you think you got pregnant? I was like, you don't know. So I'm asking you to stop doing that. And so I always have to take in somebody to protect me because I'm a great advocate for other queer folks, but I don't, when you're in your own trauma experience, you need somebody to be your advocate. So I don't go anywhere in the healthcare world, even though I know the majority of the practitioners. I've worked for decades out of these hospitals. I do not set foot as a patient without an advocate, and an advocate that is knowledgeable in queer healthcare, because it's really terrible. And I just feel like such a loss at the access and the experience through access, on top of the fact that I just feel like, the right, this like swing to the right, and this homophobia and these statements of just a disgust and for queer families. And even if it's not happening in your geographical community, like you live in a pretty progressive area, you're in San Francisco or something, it's still on your social media, and it's still everywhere. And so, we forget that just because we forget about the beliefs we hold about these families, about queer families, about trans birthers, about gender expansive, about poly families, same-sex couples, like whatever the situation is. But these families, all of us, we're still going through the exact same, those fears and worries. And is our kid going to be okay? Am I doing the right thing? Did I eat the wrong thing? Like, am I going to be a good parent? We have that, plus this really heavy cloak of homophobia that's happening. And on top of it, we rely a lot upon our chosen families, because the loss of our family of origin is statistically pretty high for queer families. And so there's all these complications around, even sometimes families of origin do come back when babies are around, but there's these complications, especially if you have mixed race families, that you're like trying to create a situation for acceptance of the community. So, we want to make sure we get people that look like the intended parents, so that the idea is this generational acceptance. But it's wild.
It's wild.
The steps.
Well,
yeah, and then the rejection after is very high. They're like, well, that's not my baby. It's not genetically related to me. It's not my grandkid. So there's a lot of loss that comes with queer conception, as well as joy, y'all, as well as joy.
Well, so let's use that then to pivot, because this is talking about kids, and so listeners know, I mean, it's in the description of this podcast, that we care about all kids. And so we want all kids to have a great family experience from preconception, if they, all the way through, regardless of the orientation, expression, or gender expression of their families. So what can my listeners do to ensure that these kids, that children are born in the best circumstance possible?
Oh, I love that question, Brad. This is literally my life's work. I think there's a few areas, but community is such a huge one, that this like really empowering safe space for queer families. We have to have a place that, like, even just for a little while, we can turn off the noise, we can turn off the like feeling of that rejection. And so having a place that is like true celebration, like just whether it's for your friends, your chosen family, for some of you it might be your family of origin, which is just like such a gift if you feel that celebration in that space, but like really cultivating and making that like a very high priority. And that when you even start thinking about kids, that you start really developing that, so that it's like solid by the time you go through your pregnancy, so that if you do need that extra support, it's there. But like really that affirming that affirming care, so that now that we're in pregnancy, you want to apply that into finding your healthcare providers that are really affirming, that if they ever make a mistake, that they correct it and then they never make that mistake again. Right. Whether it's with, who's in the room, whether it's with the preference of what you call your body parts, but like that you go through and you get to really feel like the patient, and not that you have to be also doing your self-advocacy, which we have to do all over the place. And just like a place where you can actually like sit there and just like know you've received care, that you're in like, really competent hands. And so I would say that and that continues into finding your postpartum care team. And so I would say that community piece is really important. I would say curate your social media, to just like turn off some of that noise and just fill it full of really positive channels, positive birth stories, really beautiful images that are, showing all of our shapes and sizes and colors and makeups. And just like, I think that the content we take in from preconception on makes such a huge difference. And it can, when we're looking at PMADs, which are perinatal and postpartum mood disorders, including anxiety, depression, PTSD, psychosis, like any of the things that would fall under those umbrellas. The main factors of the journey to a PMAD, we have some of them being obviously biological and genetic, some of them being from the experience, but one of the major ones is actually our thought processes. Yeah. And I'm not going to go like super rogue here if anybody's like, I need science. But like truly, we see a higher rate of postpartum mood disorders with people with really like kind of nihilist, depressive thought processes. And so I believe the content that we take in, especially in our very overstimulated world, can really support the pillars of staying from a neutrality to joy. Like if I could keep my queer clients in like the close to neutral, I mean, I would love to get everybody to joy and celebration as much as the time. But like if we can just stay in like neutral to positive and not avoiding negative emotions, I want to make this very clear. We have to feel the full range and the color of the rainbow of emotions. But I mean, as a state of being. So rather than like, I feel neutral, but I'm in a neutral state, but I can feel really, angry or rage or sad or shame, any of those things. So I think that community piece, that content, and then really celebrating your body, because we have to first do all of the the self-care and the self-love and the self-celebration. And so, if you've struggled with the size and shape of your body in your life, like, do what we can. And it's too big of a jump to be like, I'm no longer gonna, take on the environment of anti-fat bias, but instead, like, really being like, my body grew fingernails on my baby this week.
Yeah.
Like, that's amazing. Thank you, body.
Right.
Like, you're doing great. And then fueling it with things that make you feel really good. And I don't believe there's good foods and bad foods. I believe that there's just food, and you need to pick what makes your mood up, and what makes you sleep well, and what makes you have energy at the times that you want it, and quiet at the times that you don't. And so, I believe it's like an outside, it's what we take in, and then it's like how we feel from the inside out. And it can make a huge difference, because we know most of the issues that come from, whether it's like preterm labor, all the way to PMADs, our environment and our friends and our financial status. And, those are some of the highest ones, the biggest ones being oppression. And so if we can mitigate that one, because, fat phobia, homophobia, transphobia, ageism, is, those are the major things that lead to any issues in our reproductive health journeys. So we want to do what we can to fight against that. And I believe joy and safety does that.
I mean, not to oversimplify it here, Bianca, but it sounds like one of the things that you are advocating for is for healthy relationships for parents going into their conception and pregnancy, right? Those supportive relationships, those, and once again, it just kind of all spins around that, right? Having those healthy relationships in the long term, in the short term, through conception, through birth. These are such powerful things for humans.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, you're very, very right. And I know a lot of people have this belief that they like stay together especially when we're in the romantic relationship bucket, for their children. And I see so much relationship breakdown in the postpartum period because our society is not set up in a way for like how we're supposed to raise their children.
And if you like, I kind of want to do a little translation for some of my listeners that might be more familiar, because so much of what you're talking about, we've talked about on this program in different contexts. And so my listeners might be thinking, earlier on in our discussion, you were talking about the forms that you use. And of course, we've talked on this program in particular around substance use issues, what kind of intake forms you use, right? How you become trauma informed, the big step that somebody takes to access care. And if you're going to a provider that is sensitive, for example, to childhood trauma or ACEs, you put that on the form, but is that the first thing that the person needs to fill out? Maybe you should build some trust first, right? So you start by looking at the paper that you hand people. You start by looking at that environment, the language that you use, the words that you use, building regulation, building relationships. So these are all principles that my listeners have heard in so many different contexts. And so to me, I'm just excited because I'm hearing about it in this perinatal context that I haven't, thought about. So for me, my brain is just completely lit up right now. And Bianca, I want to thank you so much, not just for being a guest today, because I typically thank all my guests, but for everything that you're doing. And, I did get to, and I encourage all my listeners to seek out your materials online, Bianca, because you are, in preparing for this interview, I did a little research on doula, and you're redefining it, or at least you're expanding it in a way that makes total sense, of course. But the first thing that you come upon when you Google doula is an individual that helps during labor. And, that labor has been such a small part of the description of what you're doing, and it makes total sense. I just want to thank you so much for your work.
Oh, thank you. And if anybody feels called to this work and wants to work with the queer and BIPOC community, we have a scholarship program because we want more folks from self-segregated communities to have providers. So if you've ever been like, I'm kind of curious about offering this kind of support, check out our website and look at the scholarship program. We make a commitment to have at least 40 spots a year that are, totally covered for folks that want to work within the queer community and the BIPOC community, because we need more practitioners out there. So Babel Mia has that commitment. And so you could get yourself a seat and get into your community and really expand that, because having affirming support and that protection for families, it can only serve our children and our next generation. And it's such a gift, and it's very cool to be in those spaces. Like, every time I see a baby born, I'm like, oh my God, there's a new human on the planet, and I got to be here to witness its entry earth side.
That's a great place to end. Thank you so much, Bianca.
Thank you so much for having me.
That was Bianca Sprague. Bianca and her team assembled some materials just for Talking About Kids listeners. A link to them can be found in the episode notes and at talkingaboutkids.com. She also is offering listeners 15% off Bebo Mia resources. Just go to bebomia.com, that's BEBOMIA.com, and use the code TAK15, or Talking About Kids 15, at checkout. The Talking About Kids theme song is by the Senators. For more of their music, go to thesenatorsmusic.com. And remember, kids are young goats and young humans, and the difference is that young goats are easier to manage.